All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul Haba Alinu Latova, Baruch Meir Rena Dubin, for dedicating all the Sherman Joshos this month in honor of their children and all of the suburban sons and daughters beginning their year of study in Eretz Yisroel. May their Torah study and mitzvos in the Holy Land merit the release of our precious hostages, the success of our soldiers, and the return to their families in the arrival of Moshiach, tzidkeuni, bimheira, b'yameinu. Amen. Our week of learning sponsors, Shmuel Shira Artman, in appreciation to the entire community's outpouring of love and support towards the Links organization. Our day of learning sponsors for today, Maia, Hoffman, in loving memory and the Ili Nishmas, Reuven, Emanuel, Zichron Libracha, on the occasion of his yahrzheit. And our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Eric Schaefer, in honor of the entire Shir, and Eretz Hashem in the zuchos of our continued journey through Shas. So with that, we thank all of our sponsors. We hope that Eretz Hashem, all of the neshamas have an aliyah. We truly hope that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will finally see fit to return all of our hostages. Our soldiers should be successful. B'chol ma'aseh yadehem, and we should be zochem Eretz Hashem to besoros tovos for all of Klal Yisrael. So with that, let us begin. A lot to do today. Today's daf is Tzadik Dali, 94. We are picking up on Tzadik Gimel on days 93b. And let's actually pick up with Elaha Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 lines up from the bottom on 93b. So this is just to reorient ourselves a little bit. Remember again, we had a fascinating machlokes. If you go with the idea, if you go with the case of Mekach Tos, remember again, there is one case of Mekach Tos which everyone agrees to. What is that case? I go ahead and I sell Reuven's seeds, and I sell them Zarone Gina, which are seeds that are only to be used for planting, never used for consumption. So Reuven plants them, and they don't sprout. And again, we're always presupposing that the reason they don't sprout is not because of any, it's not because like Reuven forgot to water them, or because there was regional drought. They were defective seeds. And that's what it comes to. Reuven comes back, he says, want my money back? What's the halacha? What's the halacha? What's the halacha? He gets his money back, Mekach Tos. So remember again, in yesterday's daf, towards the top of Amud Beis, we had a fundamental machlokes about when Reuven gets back the money for his seed, can he also reclaim expenses? Because obviously the money for the seed is not just the seeds, right? There's also the time, there's also the effort, there's also the potential employees. So can he reclaim some of that money as well? So that was the machlokes. So the Gemara said, one opinion said, Tanakama said, no, you get back the money for the seeds and not the expenses. And ultimately, again, the Yesh Omrim said, even the expenses. The Gemara said, who is the Yesh Omrim? Who is that? So the Gemara wanted to suggest the Yesh Omrim is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Okay, so then the Gemara was trying to figure out, which Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel are we talking about? So I'll say, finally, so exciting, we discovered the answer to that question, Elaha Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Right, the Gemara says we're talking about this Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel. So we'll say, what did I say? How many lines up? 13? 14? Okay, a couple. Right, a couple lines up from the bottom. Elaha Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel. Disanyo. Hamoli chitin litchon v'lo lasasan. So let's say a person I went to give my wheat to a grinder. To a grinder to go ahead and make flour, and he forgot to wet the wheat. We saw yesterday, we actually did this yesterday. The Rashban points out that it was customary before you go ahead and you grind the wheat that you moisten it. Otherwise, again, it turns out clumpy. So he didn't do this. And as right, Lola Sasan, Vasan Subin Omursan. And as a result, it became bran, fine bran, coarse bran. In other words, he compromised the quality of the flour. Kemach, Lenachtum, Vafal Pasni Pulim. Or, I gave flour to a baker, and it turns out that he didn't do a good job, and he made crumbly bread. Pasni Pulim means falling bread. The bread didn't have the right consistency. Or, or I gave an animal to a butcher to be shechted, and the animal, the butcher, the shochet, botched it. He botched it, and it became an avela. What's halacha? Chayit mipnei shuknos yischar. In all of these cases, these individuals are chayiv. Why are they chayiv? Because they're considered to be a shomer sachar. Right, they're considered to be a paid custodian, and a paid custodian ultimately again is chayiv. This effectively would be wouldn't necessarily be pshia per se, but halacha l'maisa a shomer sacher would be chayiv for this. Okay, Rabbi Shmuel says, listen to this. So we'll say, so now, what does chayiv mean? What does chayiv mean? What is he chayiv for? What is he chayiv for? He's chayiv for the object, right? So the grinder will be chayiv for the grain, and the baker will be chayiv for the flour, and the butcher will be chayiv for the animal. Now watch this. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, no sin lo d'mei boshto, udmei boshes archav. This is fascinating. Rabbi Shmuel says, not only are these individuals chayiv for the amount of money, for the value of the item that they actually botched, but there's also supplemental expenses, supplemental costs, namely my embarrassment and the embarrassment of my guests. Meaning what? So I go ahead and I have company, and now I'm serving them this bread. I think the bread is fine. It turns out that now it's pasni pulin, right? And now it's crumbly bread. It's not nice. So now I'm embarrassed because this is what I'm serving my guests. My guests are embarrassed because they're both saying, sometimes when you're by someone and you see something unfortunate happen to your host, it's embarrassing for the guest. It's embarrassing to see someone else in an uncomfortable situation. So Rabbi Shmuel says, it's incredible. So not only is the baker chayiv because he produced an inferior product, and therefore again he's liable because he took perfectly good wheat and did not do a good job with it, but there's all these supplemental expenses as well. My embarrassment, the embarrassment of the guest. However we gauge these amounts is not important right now. So Rabbi Shmuel used to say, it was beautiful. There was an incredible custom in Yerushalayim. And what was that? Hamoser su'uda lechavero v'kilkala nosim lo d'mei bashto u'd'mei boshes archav. What was the minhag Yerushalayim? The minhag Yerushalayim was that if you go ahead and you sold a meal to someone, right? You sold food to someone for a meal. And what happens? The food was not good, right? In other words, I'm a food seller, right? The purveyor of food, a caterer. I have this, whatever. I have a store. I go ahead and I sell food. So I go ahead. Reuven buys food from me. He's making a suda. The food was terrible. Then what's halacha? No sin lo d'mei bashto. I pay not only do I give Reuven his money back for the food, but I also give him money for his humiliation, for his embarrassment, and the embarrassment of his guests. So I'll say, now I want to point out, we don't paskin halacha l'maisa this way, right? In other words, we would paskin that if I go ahead and sell Reuven food and the food is bad, Reuven is definitely entitled to his money back. Is he entitled to boshes? Is he entitled to humiliation, humiliation of his guests? No, because we would call that what? What would we call that? Grama, right. So in other words, that's causative damages, and in general, in halacha, you're not going to be chayiv for grama. That's the general approach. But again, conceptually, remember, let's go full circle. Now we discover the opinion of the Yesh Omrim. Who was the Yesh Omrim? So remember, what did the Yesh Omrim say? The Yesh Omrim said that if I sold zarone gina, seed that was only meant to be planted, no one consumes it. I sell it to Reuven. It doesn't sprout anything. What's the halacha? Reuven has the ability to come back and claim mekachtos. He has the ability to come back and to claim, again, you owe me my money back. The Yesh Omrim said not only that, he has the ability to go ahead and recapture additional expenses as a result of the failed seed. Okay? Who was the Yesh Omrim? Now we know. Now it's Rabbi Gamliel. It's Rabbi Gamliel. Now, halacha l'maisa, again, I know who it is. Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who said that when you go ahead and you fail to perform the service that you were contracted for, not only are you obligated to return the money you receive, but if there are any supplemental damages, you are chayiv for that as well. Incredible. The Gemara ends off with an unrelated idea, but quite beautiful. Od mina gadol hayib Yerushalayim. So I'll say, so it's fascinating. It's fascinating, right? Why, before we even go on, why was this the minhag in Yerushalayim? Hamoser su'uda lechavero v'kilkala no sein lo d'mei bashto. Right? So what's hers? Why Yerushalayim? Why Yerushalayim? Why not Minhag Tel Aviv? Why not Minhag Modi'in? Why was it Minhag Yerushalayim? That if you go ahead and you gave food to someone, it's beautiful. Beautiful. So again, and the truth is, I should take the opportunity. First, I want to welcome Rabbi Leo D, who is joining us here for Daf Yomi this morning from Efrat to Eretz Yisroel, and Baruch Hashem is going to be with us for Shabbos, and already had a tremendous impact in our community. And Baruch Hashem. And Bernie doesn't even need a last name. He just, right? Bernie, did you move here officially? Are you? Baruch Hashem. Bernie Lichter, who is now, Baruch Hashem, part of our extended kila as well. Father-in-law of Rav David, and Baruch Hashem is supposed to have you as, you've always been part of this year. Now physically you're here. We're supposed to have you here. So I'll say, so again, why is this Minhag Yerushalayim? Why, in other words, think about this. So it's beautiful. Minhag Yerushalayim was that if you went ahead and you sold someone food, and it turned out the food was bad, you You pay them back, you give them back their money, and you also pay for their embarrassment and the embarrassment of their friends. Again, why minig Yerushalayim? So I'll say, what is Yerushalayim? What is Yerushalayim? The Mishnah in Maseches Avos talks about the various, the Asara Nisim, Na'asu Lavosenu, the Beis HaMikdash. Those are the 10 miracles that occurred in the Beis HaMikdash. The truth is, towards the end, one of the miracles that is recorded is, V'lo Amar Adam Tsarli Makom Sha'alin B'Yerushalayim. A person never said, there's not enough space for me to stay in Yerushalayim. Now, the Mefarshim point out, what is that referring to? It's referring to the fact that, remember, think about this, we have 3 regalim, 3 pilgrimage festivals. Everybody has to converge on Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is a beautiful city, but how is it possibly big enough to accommodate all of Klal Yisrael? It doesn't make any sense. So it sounds like what the Mishnah is saying is that there was a miracle. And just like in the Beis HaMikdash itself, Omdim Sefufim, Mishtachavim Revachim, when we stood, we were packed in, but when we prostrated, there was room for everyone. So this miracle seems to extend to the city of Yerushalayim, that when everyone packed in for the regel, somehow miraculously, there was room to expand. There was room to. Chassam Sofer says something amazing. Chassam Sofer says, it does not say that Yerushalayim expanded. That's not what it says. What does it say? V'lo Amar Adam Sarli Hamakom. Was it cramped during Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot? Ridiculous. Was the traffic unbearable? 100%. Could you get a hotel room? No way. Probably not even a shawarma, right? It was crazy. What was the miracle? V'lo Amar Adam Sarli Hamakom. The miracle was no one complained. That was the miracle. No one complained. No one ever said, I can't take this congestion. Why? Because when you are packed in with your people, there is no greater simcha in the world. When you are shoulder to shoulder with Am Yisrael, even when you're sitting in traffic with Am Yisrael, even when you're standing in line with Am Yisrael, there is no greater bracha in the world. Yerushalayim was a city that is uniquely poised to bring Am Yisrael together. It's Ir Shechubrala Yachtov. That is the power of Yerushalayim. Everyone gravitates towards it, and somehow, some way, it has the ability to mamish bring everyone together. And perhaps that's the pshat over here. Yerushalayim has a higher level of Ben Adam L'Chavero. There's a higher standard of interpersonal conduct in Yerushalayim Yer HaKodesh, to the point that there was this minhag. The minhag Yerushalayim was, if you sold someone bad food and you embarrassed them and you embarrassed their guests, not only did you have to pay them back the money for their food, but you also had to pay them back the money for their embarrassment and the embarrassment of their guests. This didn't exist anywhere else, because Yerushalayim is a different kind of place, because Yerushalayim is a different kind of city. Because Yerushalayim, again, is Ir Shechubra Lo Yachtav. It's a city that brings us together. Yerushalayim is V'lo Amar Adam Sarli Hamakom. The essence of Yerushalayim is Ben Adam L'Chavero. The essence of Yerushalayim is Achdus. The essence of Yerushalayim is Isha Echad B'Lev Echad. That is what Yerushalayim is. And therefore, perhaps, that's why this minhag dafka existed in Yerushalayim and not any other place. It also ends off, Od Minhag Yerushalayim. There's another minhag in Yerushalayim. This is actually very beautiful as well. Mapa Prusa Agabe HaPesach. There was so listen to this. If you were having a meal, so remember again, it was customary when a person was having a meal to open their home tachnas, to allow other people to come and join in their meal, specifically the poor. So what would you do? So they used to hang like a sheet on the doorway. Kozman shemapa prusa archin nichnasin. As long as the sheet was there, guests could enter. Nistalka hamapa, when the sheet was not there, ein ha'archin nichnasin. Guests cannot come in. So I'll say, so they had this beautiful mechanism to show, like, when should people come in, when should people not come in, when could guests come in, when could archin. The Rashbam says over here, archin nichnasin is about 7 lines from the bottom. V'takana tovihi lekavalas archin. This is a good takana for achnasas archin. Sheyedu kisham yochlu v'yelchu sham lechol. People could know when they could come in for a meal, when they can't come in for a meal. So we'll say there is this incredible and heightened sensitivity. The one thing, it is beautiful to be able to do hachnasas archim, and the oreach should always feel welcome. But the oreach also has to be careful never to put the balabayis in an uncomfortable position. Let's say someone is not accepting guests. Let's say someone doesn't have food for guests. Let's say someone is just in a difficult life situation and it's not a good time for them to open their home. So it's beautiful to see over here as they had this mappa, they had this sheet. And when the sheet was up, time to come and guests are accepted and guests are welcome. When the sheet is not up, not a good time for guests. And I will say all tied in to that beautiful sensitivity and that beautiful holiness that was unique to Yerushalayim Yirat Kodesh. Incredible. Mishnah. I will say, Rabbi Nachman writes that when you learn Torah of Eretz Yisroel, right, when you learn Gemaras about Eretz Yisroel, Psuk about Eretz Yisroel, Rabbi Nachman says, in those moments, the neshama itself is transported to Eretz Yisroel. So it's just so important to know that when we learn Gemaras like this, it's not just like a nice idea, beautiful insight. It's mamish, an opportunity to spend a few moments on the holy soil of Eretz Yisroel. Incredible. Mishnah. Hamocher peros l'chavero. All right, back to earth. Hamocher peros l'chavero. I sell produce to my friend. I both say this is a fascinating Mishnah. So harizim mekabel alav rova tinofas l'sa. So I'll say, listen to this. When you sell produce, it's very interesting. The Mishnah accepts the idea that with any produce, there is always some level of impurities that are mixed in. That's the way it works. Right now, remember, we're not talking about supermarket produce, right? They're talking about farm produce. So I go to the farm, I purchase from my friend. There's always impurities mixed in with that. So for example, I sell produce to my friend. So listen to this. So Reuven accepts 1/4 sa'ah of impurities for every sa'ah of produce purchased, which is a lot. Very, very, very interesting. Te'inim, if I'm buying figs, v'kabalav eser mitula os lameah. I assume that there are 10 wormy figs for every 100. So, in other words, 1/10 spoilage. 1/10 spoilage. Martev shal yayin, listen to this. I buy a wine cellar, we should all be zocha. Mekabel alav eser kosesos lameah. Right? I accept the fact that I will find, listen to this, 10 spoiled barrels for every 100. Well, it's fascinating. I don't know. Obviously, I have no frame of reference to this. It seems like very high rates of spoilage. But fascinating. Okay, kankanim b'sharon, if you go ahead and you buy kankanim are jugs. Kankanim are jugs. In the Sharon, which is Sharon is a region in Eretz Yisroel, mekabel alav eser pitzos lemeah. You accept the fact that 10 of them are going to be defective out of every 100. So both sides are fascinating. So again, these are the rates of both sides. Just point out how incredible it is. I'm not going to get into it now. I'm not getting into it now. But how incredible it is that there's a reference over here to Sharon. Sharon, if you I'm not getting into it. We'll save it for later. But in the Kohen Gadol's tefillah, when he came out of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, there was a special reference of the Anshe Sharon, but for a different time. Says the Gemara, Tani Rav Katina. See, I could resist. I could resist every once in a while. Tani Rav Katina. We'll say second to last line. Tani Rav Katina. Rova kitnis l'sa'ah. So remember again, Rav Katina said as follows: When you're buying, let's say a sa'ah of wheat. So Rav Katina says, we accept the fact that there could be up to 1/4 of a sa'ah of legumes mixed in. In other words, that often you had different types of produce growing in close proximity to each other. Not too close, because you have to avoid kilayim situations, but ultimately, again, close. So therefore, it's understood that if you buy a sa'ah of wheat, it would be common to have legumes mixed in. So Rav Katina says, up to 1/4 of sa'ah of legumes for every sa'ah of wheat. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Now, Rav Katina sounds like he's saying over here that halacha l'maisa, when you buy, so the whole idea is when the Gemara creates these percentages, that means that as the buyer, I'm accepting this. In other words, so Rav Katina is saying like this: I go ahead and I buy a sa'ah of wheat from Reuven. I get back home, I begin to separate out. I find there's 1/4 sa'ah of kitness, of legumes. So I can't go back to Reuven and say, Reuven, hey, I bought a sa'ah of wheat. What is 1/4 sa'ah of legumes going on over it? No, you accept this level of impurity. You accept this level of impurity ultimately, again, in the purchase. Now, here's what's interesting. The Gemara, Rav Katina seems to say, what do I accept? 1/4 sa'ah of legumes. Va'af lo. What about dirt? Now, it sounds like he's saying, I accept legumes, but I'm not going to accept dirt. But how could it be that, as the Gemara says, in dirt, in other words, you're not accepting some level of dirt mixed in? V'amar Rava Barchia, kitusva mishmei de Rabba, borer tsarar migrono shel chavero, tab of tzadik dalit, no sino de mechitin. Rabbi said, that's not the halacha. We learned as follows. Listen to this. So Rabbi said, this is actually a fascinating case. If I go, let's say Reuven's selling produce, and I go over to Reuven's produce, and I start picking out the pebbles from the produce, ultimately, again, I owe Reuven money. Now, why do I owe Reuven money? Why? Because remember, again, it's accepted that when you sell produce, there's a certain amount of impurity that is mixed in with the produce. Now that I'm removing the dirt, I'm removing the pebbles, what is that going to do? That's going to require Reuven to give more wheat in order to actually make up the volume. So what do you see from here? That when you purchase produce, there is an actual certain amount of dirt, of impurity, that is included within the purchase. So what is Rav Katina talking about? To which the Gemara says, listen to this, kitnis, ruba afruris, pachos mirabua. Va'afruris, ruba, so the Gemara says, kitnis, rova, afruris, pachos mirabua. So we'll say, what is it saying? Look at the Rashbam. So Rashbam says as follows. He says, kitnis mekabal alav rova. So Rashbam says, kiditani Rav Katina aval afruris pachos mirova mashehu de mekabal aval rova afruris kiyesem mirova kitnis lo mekabal. So we'll say, so this is fascinating. See, he says that when it comes to wheat, essentially the way it works is like this. Kitnis, if there's legumes mixed in, I'll accept up to a quarter of a sa'ah of legumes mixed in. Afruris, dirt, less than a quarter of sa'ah. So in other words, not all impurities are created equal. So again, if I'm purchasing wheat, if there's up to a quarter of sa'ah of kitnis, of legumes mixed in, fine. We'll say more than a quarter, then what? More than a quarter? The Gemara isn't talking about more than a quarter. Obviously, I'm going back to Reuven. I'm saying what's going on over here. We'll get to that in just a little bit. When it comes to dirt, however, afruris is just dirt, less than a quarter is acceptable. Okay, so now we begin to see different measurements for different types of impurities. Va'afruris rubalo. Is that true? Is that true? That when it comes to dirt, it's only a quarter, it's only less than a quarter of a sa'ah. But what if it is exactly a quarter of a sa'ah? Is that not good? V'atanya we learned, hamocher peres lechavero. I sell produce to Reuven. Chitin mekabel alav rova kitnis l'sa'ah. So let's listen to this. So this brisa sounds very similar to our Mishnah, but it's not. So watch this. I sell Reuven peiros, I sell him produce. So now the Gemara says, depends what kind of produce. If I sell him wheat, so again, you have to be makabel a quarter sa'ah of kitnis, which means again, Reuven, the buyer, accepts the fact that there's up to a quarter sa'ah of legumes mixed into this. So'orim, what if I sell him barley? Makabel alav roba nishuvis l'sa'ah. He accepts the fact that there's going to be a quarter sa'ah of straw mixed in. Adoshim, lentils, mekabel alav ruba afruris l'sa'ah. He accepts with lentils, he accepts the fact that there's going to be a quarter sa'ah of dirt mixed in. So now the Gemara says something very interesting. My love huadin lechitim l'sa'arin nabosai. And here's what's interesting. The Gemara presupposes like this. The mixture of dirt can't be unique to lentils. It must be that whatever the Brisa says about dirt by lentils applies to what? Everything else as well, which then would tell us that a quarter sa'ah of dirt for every sa'ah of produce is a valid amount of impurity to be mixed in. A valid amount of impurity. So I will say, so now that contradicts what we said before, because the Gemara was suggesting that when it comes to wheat, so you can have less than a quarter sa'ah of impurities, but not a quarter sa'ah. Here it sounds like by dirt, even a quarter sa'ah is totally acceptable. To which the Gemara says, no. Shiny adashim, no, it's not necessarily true. It could very well be that actually when the Gemara talks about dirt, it's dafka talking about dirt by lentils. Why? This is fascinating. Why? Shiny adashim demi akar akarlu. So say, as opposed to grain, which is harvested, right? You don't pull grain out of the ground. You cut it. So because you cut it, there's no stem that's coming out. That's different than lentils. Lentils are not cut, lentils are pulled. So because of that, what often comes with lentils? Dirt. So it could very well be that lentils themselves have a higher, we'll call it, higher amount of impurity level, right? Higher impurity level that is acceptable. So you can have, let's say, a quarter sa'ah of dirt for every sa'ah of lentils, because lentils just have a lot more dirt attached to them. So maybe, when it comes to lentils, which are pulled out of the ground and therefore have more dirt attached to them, a quarter sa'ah of impurity is an acceptable level. But maybe by wheat and by barley, less than a quarter sa'ah is acceptable, but a quarter saw is not acceptable. So tifshot minei. What do you see from here? So tifshot minei chiti usari dafurus lo mekabel. So we'll say, well, maybe the Gemara says, let's take this even further. Why don't we say that maybe dirt shouldn't be acceptable at all when it comes to wheat and barley? In other words, maybe I'll accept some amount of lentils mixed in, but if you're going to tell me that wheat and dirt are harvested, which we know they're not pulled up from the ground, so maybe there should be no acceptable level of dirt impurity mixed in. So Gemara says, no, that's not true. Adashim itzrichalei. The truth is, the point of this whole brace was to teach us about lentils. What is teaching about lentils? I would have thought by lentils. This is fascinating. I would have thought that by lentils, since what's the halacha? Since lentils are pulled out of the ground, maybe I will say lentils have even a higher impurity threshold. And maybe by lentils, the halacha is that even what? Even more than a quarter saw for every saw of dirt should be allowed. Or, let me say it differently. Maybe by lentils, even a quarter saw of dirt for every saw of produce should be permitted. To which the Gemara says, Kamash Malon, no. Kamash on that even for lentils. Even for lentils, halacha l'maisa again, we accept up to a quarter saw of dirt for every saw of lentils. Okay, so we'll say, so now, here's what I want to point out. So what's happened over here is that halacha l'maisa, we've established that essentially a quarter saw of impurity for every saw of produce is the acceptable threshold. That's what the Mishnah thought. We thought maybe it was less than a quarter saw. Seems to be across the board. Quarter saw is the amount that we're going with. So that's our first nugget of halach in all of this. So for every saw of produce that you accept, so ultimately again we accept up to a quarter saw of impurities. Whether those impurities are dirt or the impurities are lentils, that's what we accept. Now let's go back to Amrafuna in Balanafos Minapa. So we'll say this is a fascinating case. So what's this case in Balanafos? So we'll say look at the Rashbam. It's the second of the widest lines of the Rashbam. Amrafuna in Ba Lokeach lahakbe betinoves. Denira be'enav sheyish lo tenufa yoser meribua ubalo keach lenafoso ledas im yesh sham yoser meruba v'nimtza ba yoser. So also listen to this. I buy produce from Reuven. Okay, so again I learned the Gemara, so I know that I have to accept up to 1/4. I have to accept up to 1/4 of impurity for every saw of produce that I purchase. I eyeball this and I say, you know what? It looks like too much impurity. So what do? I say, listen, Reuven, here's what we're going to do. I'm purchasing it from you. I'm going to sift this out. And I want to see ultimately, again, what's going on over here. So we'll say, let's say I sift it out, and let's say it turns out that there's more than a quarter saw of impurity. There's more than a quarter saw. Okay? So what's the halacha? So Rav Huna says, Menafa es kulo. Rav Huna says, this is fascinating. Once it turns out that there's more than a quarter sa'ah, I have the right to sift out all of the impurity, and Reuven has an obligation to make up the missing amount of produce. Take a look at the Rashbam. Menafes kulo v'yachser lo hamocher chitin kinegdan o maos v'lo yomar rova kibar machalta v'amosar shalim lecha. So we'll say this is absolutely riveting. So Rav Huna says like this. So in this case, where Reuven overstepped, now again, we're going to talk about what we think happened over here, but it turned out I was right. There was more than a quarter saw of dirt mixed in over here. So now Rav Huna says, once that happens, I, the seller, am permitted to remove all of the impurity, and Reuven, I, the buyer, am permitted to remove all of the impurity, and Reuven, the seller, is obligated to make me whole. He's obligated either to refund some of my money, right, or he's obligated to give me more produce. So this is incredible. So the Gemara says, Amr le din of Amr le kinasa. Bless you. So some say the statement of Rav Huna is a din, a halacha, and some say it's a kinas, it's a penalty. So Amr le dina, some say it's a halacha. Why? What's the halacha? Man diyav zuzi apiri shapiri. Man diyav zuzi apiri shapiri yav. So let's listen to this. This is the psychology over here of the sale is fascinating. So the first opinion that says that this is a din, this halacha says as follows. We'll say, when I go to Reuven, I purchase a sa'ah of produce. What do I want? A sa'ah of produce. How much impurity am I willing to accept? None. Really, I'm willing to, right? If I'm paying for a sa'ah of produce, I want a sa'ah of produce. That's what I want. I'm not willing to accept any impurity. However, Veruba lo tarich inish yinish. But the reality is, I'm really not willing to bother myself, right? The tircha is not worth it for me, as long as there's less than a quarter sa'ah of impurity mixed in. In other words, in reality, I want to buy a sa'ah of produce. And do I suspect that there's some impurities mixed in there? I do. But it's not worth my while to go ahead and start sifting out. It's just not worth it for me to try to start sifting out any impurities. It's not worth it. However, Yosem Miruva Tarich Inish. More than a rove, absolutely I will go ahead and try to sift out that's there. Now watch this. V'chevan de tarach b'kulei. And now once I'm already going ahead and sifting out the impurities, so then ultimately again, I'll do everything. The Torah say that's the opinion that says this is a din. The din says when I buy sa'ah produce, I don't accept any level of impurity. But it's not worth my while to start removing a quarter sa'ah. But once it rises to the occasion of more than a sa'ah, and I'm going in there, then at the end of the day I'm removing all the purity and I'm getting everything that I'm rightfully entitled to, i.e. a complete sa'ah. Others say no, that this is a knas on Reuven. How so? Ruba shchiach, Yosem Ruba lo shchiach. So we'll say the knas mindset says like this. It is common to have up to a quarter sa'ah of impurity mixed in. More than a quarter of sa'ah is not shriach. V'ihu da'arif. Wow. So you both say, the second school of thought says like this. It is normal to have some level of impurity mixed into the produce. And Chazal said, what is the acceptable level? What's the acceptable level? A quarter sa'ah. That's normal. More than a quarter sa'ah, what do we consider? More than a quarter sa'ah, what does it look like? It looks like produce tampering. Right? It looks like Reuven is purposely mixing in more impurities in order to go ahead and have to sell less product. Well, once that happens, v'ihu da'arif, v'kevan da'arif kansur rabbana b'kulei. And once Reuven now is engaging in produce tampering, Chazal penalized him. They said, okay, that's it. So now I, as a seller, have the right to go in there, get rid of all of the impurities, and Reuven has an obligation to not make me whole in the amount of a complete sa'ah. Incredible. So I'll say, so now, here's what we have. We have the statement of Rav Huna, right? The statement of Rav Huna is, I purchased produce from Reuven. It looks to me like there is, right? Let's go back, right? Halacha number one. What's halacha number one? You purchase a sa'ah of produce. How much, what's the impurity that you're willing to accept? Quarter sa'ah for every sa'ah of produce. Whether that's dirt, whether that's legumes, it doesn't really matter what it is. That's what I'm willing to accept. Fine, that's halacha number one. Now, so I purchased the produce. I'm accepting some level of impurity. Fantastic. Now, I eyeball it. I say, this looks like more than a quarter sa'ah. Sure enough, it's more than a quarter sa'ah. Rav Huna says, once it's more than a quarter sa'ah, the purchaser, have the right to remove all of the impurity. Show Reuven, there was, whatever it is, 3/4 of a sa'ah. Well, that would be a lot. Right? Half a sa'ah of impurity, and Reuven is now obligated to go ahead and make me whole for the entire amount. In other words, Reuven can't say, okay, I'll bring you back to the quarter sa'ah level. Right? That you can't do. Right? In other words, Reuven can't say, listen, here, you already accepted upon yourself a quarter sa'ah. Right? So that, I don't have to make you whole for that. Reuven can't do that. But at that point, again, he has to now make me whole for the entire sa'ah. Machlokes, is that a din? Is that a halacha? Or is that a knas? Fine. So now let's go back there. So Meisei, the Gemara is a kasha. Kol sa'ah sheish bo rova mimin achar yimait. Any sa'ah, if I purchase a sa'ah produce, and at the end of the day, it turns out that it has a quarter sa'ah of a different type, right? Legumes, dirt, whatever it might be, yimait. So I'll say, what does yimait mean? What is yimait? So yimait means you have to diminish it. Now, what is this case? Look at the Rashbam for just a moment. The Rashbam says over here, Kol sa tvua shish barova hakab mimin achar yimait lo lehavi ruba v'achar kach yizraena. So we'll say, so this is talking about kilayim over here. The point over here is, what do you see? That if there's more than a quarter sa'ah, I'm obligated to bring it back. Ultimately, again, to the quarter sa'ah level. Savrua. So we assumed ultimately again that a quarter of a kav ba'kilayim is the equivalent of more than a kav of impurity mixed into produce. Vikatoni yimait. And all it says you have to do is bring it back to the quarter kav level. Not reimburse him or not go ahead and make him whole for the entire impurity amount. To which the Gemara says, "Katani yimait lo ruba de kilaim ki ruba de hacha." No, not necessarily true, but rather again, 1/4 of impurity. In this case, impurity means some other species. Is just like the rove over here by impurities. If that's the case, amai yimait. So if that's the case, then why is there an obligation to go ahead and by kilayim bring it down beneath a 1/4 kav? To which the Gemara says, "Mishum chumra di kilayim." Kilayim is different, Rabbi. Remember again, kilayim represents the planting of forbidden mixtures. So halacha l'maisa again, because there is a chumrah of kilayim, even by kilayim, we could accept up to a 1/4 sa'ah for every sa'ah produce of different species mixed in. But because kilayim is more chumrah, we have to bring it below a 1/4 kav. Ihaki, if that's the case, we'll say amud beis. Ihaki, ema seifa. Ema seifa. Look at the secondary case. Rabbi Yossi Omer Yavar. Rabbi Yossi says you have to go ahead. Rabbi Yossi says Yavar. You have to go ahead and do borer. You have to go ahead and remove the impurities. So the Gemara says, and that means everything. Look at the Rashbam. Yavar esakol. You have to remove everything. Si amit bishlama kiyosimi ruba tinof as dami. If you say that ultimately again by kilayim, so it's like then it's equivalent to more than a 1/4 sa'ah of impurities by produce. Bahakam then that's the machlokas. Tanakama savar lo kansina netera atu isura. Tanakama says we do not penalize a person in a technically permitted case lest he come to violate. Rabbi Yossi savar kansina. Rabbi Yossi says we do kinasim. Eli amrit kiruba dami. But if we hold that ultimately again that it is the equivalent to a 1/4 sa'ah, then amai yavar. Then why is there a need by kilayim to go ahead and separate out the entire amount? According to Rabbi Yossi. To which the Gemara says, "Hasam hainu time with Rabbi Yossi mishum demechsi ki mekayim kilayim." So we'll say Rabbi Yossi has a different opinion. Rabbi Yossi has a totally different approach to this. So we'll say just to frame this, Rabbi Yossi essentially comes from the vantage point that you can't have any mixtures of species because any mixtures of species looks like kilayim. Just like, even if it's not technical kilayim, it looks like kilayim. And then Rabbi Yossi's position is, anytime you have different types of items mixed together, you gotta remove the secondary item from the mixture. And that's Rabbi Yossi, and that of course is a more extreme position by kilayim. But in general, the halacha by kilayim will be the same thing by impurities, that you could accept up to a 1/4 sa'ah, ultimately again of impurities or of foreign item in your primary mixture. Okay, now we wanted to use this case ultimately to try to figure out is, by our case, by Rav Huna, is it a knas, is it a din? But it turned out the comparison didn't really work. So the Gemara says, let's go back. So the Gemara says, Tashma. So we'll say, so now remember again, let's keep focused. What are you trying to figure out over here? We have a statement of Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, I purchased produce from Reuven. I eyeball it, it looks to me like more than a 1/4 of a sa'ah. It turns out, I measure it is more than a 1/4 of sa'ah. Rav Huna says, if that's the case, I as the seller now have the right to remove all of the impurities and to go ahead and be reimbursed for Reuven for all of the impurities. So now we're accepting whether or not that's halach l'maisa, we'll see. But we are accepting that statement for now as fact. Now our question is that a knas or is that a din? Right? Is it a penalty? Is it a penalty that we're just penalizing Reuven because we suspect that he mixed in extra impurities, and now the system is going to penalize you. You tried to go ahead and cheat the buyer by mixing in more impurity, where that system is going to penalize you and say, now you have to pay for all of the impurity. Or no, maybe it's a din. Maybe it's just a halacha, and ultimately, again, it's not a penalty. And I will say, what's the nafkamina if it's a din or a penalty? Like, who cares? Like, essentially the same thing. So I'll tell you why it matters. It matters a lot because this gives us a psychological insight into the buying habits of an individual. Because if you say that it's a din, the din says like this: as a buyer, what level of impurity do I accept? Do I accept? Zero. So 1 second, but we just said that you accept up to a 1/4 of impurity. Yeah, because I'm really too lazy to do anything about it. So in other words, I really accept zero impurity. But human nature is that up to a 1/4 of a sa'ah, it's like a mochel. In other words, I don't really accept it, but it's not worth my while. I shouldn't say lazy. It's not worth my while to do anything to get that out of the mixture. So I'm kind of like mochel on it. But in reality, I accept nothing. And therefore, when it turns out that Reuven mixed in more, so now I'm makbid. Get everything out of there and make me whole for everything. Kinas approach says, no, a person accepts. In other words, I proactively accept the fact that there is going to be a quarter sa'ah of impurity mixed in. I accept that. It's not a mechila. It's kind of a mechila, but it's a proactive acceptance of that within this transaction. So you're going to see that mindset has a tremendous impact on some of the cases that come. So let's go like that. It says in our Tashma, a very interesting case here. Shnai, we saw this before. Shnai shefkidu eitzel echad. Suppose they watch this. Reuven and Shimon come over to me. They both deposit money by me. So now what happens? So eitzel echad. Zeh mana v'zeh masayim. Now watch this. Let's say one of them deposits $100 and one of them deposits $200. So we'll say, so now what happens? They both give it to me. So now, Zeh Omer Masayim Shali, V'zeh Omer Masayim Shali. So we'll say, so now what ends up happening? So now, this is why it's important to pay attention when people deposit money with you. I was checking my email or something, so they gave it to me because I trusted Reuven and Shimon, they're good guys. It turns out, they come back to retrieve their money, and what happens? They both claim, shockingly, that the 200 belongs to them. So both Reuven and Shimon are claiming to be the owner of the 200. So what do? So the halacha is no sin lezemana ulezemana v'ashar yemunach ad sheyavo Eliyahu. So I gave Reuven $100, I give Shimon $100. What about the third 100? That remains until Eliyahu Hanavi comes. Okay, so that's Moshiach comes, Eliyahu Hanavi comes. Eliyahu Hanavi will work that out. Now we'll say, what does this have to do with our case? So take a look at the Rashbam. This is actually very exciting because Rashbam is exactly across. Sometimes you get these little kisses from the Ribono Shel Olam where he just tells us, I'm so proud of you. You're doing great. And let me show you. I'm going to make life a little bit easier for you just for a moment. So literally just move your finger leftward. The Rashbam is right there. Shnayim Shef Kidu, the Rashbam says, Alishna Diknas Aparich, Shmamina, Lo Kansinan Hamosa. So both sides. Now here's what's interesting. The Gemara is bringing this case as a kasha against the opinion that says Rav Huna is a knas. Right? You see, in the knas approach, what do we say? That where there's a knas, we say, okay, now that we knased you, you have to go ahead and pay back everything. So I will say, now watch this. Now, if you took the knas mindset to this case, right, so let's say imagine I took the knas mindset to this case, right? Where Reuven and Shimon are both showing up and they both say that they're the owner of the 200. So if we took a knas mindset, what should the halacha be? What should the halacha be? No one gets anything. No one gets anything. One of you guys is lying. We're going to knas you, and the knas mindset says no one gets anything. See, it's interesting. We're bringing this case to see that again, we don't apply this knas mindset. Look at the Rashbam. Lishna the knas aparach shmamina lo kansinan hamosar v'achinami amai kansura rabana bekulei ela b'mosarova. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, so the Gemara is suggesting over here, the Gemara is raising this kasha that you see from here that what we do is where there is a suffix. So we deal with the suffix amount, but not with the vada. We don't penalize. So the Gemara is suggesting, why don't we apply this same metric to the produce case also? In other words, why are we allowing the buyer to recapture the quarter sa'ah, which is the part that was allowed to be mixed in to the produce? In other words, that should be like the given. That should be like the sunk cost. That's the sunk cost of doing business. Okay, you want to say that now the seller has the obligation to go ahead and make up for the additional amount over the quarter sa'ah, I understand. But why are you knassing the entire amount? After all, look at this case. We don't knas, we don't penalize the entire amount. We don't say, Reuven and Shimon, one of you is lying there for the entire amount is put in messianic escrow, and when Eliyahu comes, he'll go ahead and decide what to do. We don't do that. Instead, what we say is, okay, there's a disputed $100 over here. We'll give each of them 100 and allow the remaining to remain in that Eliyahu and the Eliyahu escrow. What's going on over here? So Shmuel says, no, the cases aren't comparable. Hachi hashta hasam vaday mana lamar umana lamar. It's very different about saying. In the case of the money, what do I know? I know with absolute certainty that what? Well, I will say, what is the one fact I know in this case? It is Reuven and Shimon both owe, or both are owed. Well, they both own $100. Right? That's not contested. Right? Ultimately, so we'll say, so what am I going to do? I'm going to withhold all of the money. How does that make sense? And now, by the way, there is a school of thought that says that the entire amount is put in messianic escrow. Right? And how does that make sense? That goes ahead and disincentivizes ramos, right? Chicanery or trickery or dishonesty. Because we'll say otherwise, right? Because otherwise, like if you're Reuven, right? If Reuven is one who went ahead and deposited the $100, right? Reuven says, hey, you know what? I have an easy scheme to get rich. let me claim that I'm the owner of the 200 and I have nothing to lose. So Reuven has to know that he has something to lose as well. But that's a separate opinion not quoted over here. So in this case over here, we know that everyone owns $100. Hacha, in the case of the produce, migemar, the lav kule aruve ariv. I will say, in the produce case, maybe Reuven the seller did mix in all of the impurities. In other words, maybe that's what happened over here. That is not an impossibility. In other words, while it's true that we accept a quarter sa of impurity for every sa of produce, it is not beyond the realm of possibility that when we find more than a quarter sa, maybe Reuven mixed in all of the impurities. So because of that, maybe the knas, maybe the penalty has to be more sweeping in the produce case than it is in the money case. All right, let's go back there. Says the Gemara, Tashma Miseifa. I'm Rabbi Yossi. Here we go. Rabbi Yossi says, in game, Mahiv Sidrama. Here it is. Rabbi Yossi saying, this is the money case, right? Reuven and Shimon deposited money with me. One of them deposited 100. One of them deposited 200. I wasn't paying attention. They come back to reclaim their money. Each of them claimed to be the owner of the 200. Rabbi Yossi says, put the entire $300 in Messianic escrow. No one touches it. Shavuot saying, wow, so here it is. So that seems to support the kenas approach of the produce, of Rav Huna's din. Right? So what do you see from here? You see from here that when there is some type of deceitful behavior, essentially what we do is the halacha activates kenas option, and kenas option seizes everything. But isn't one of them really entitled to 100? Isn't both of them really both entitled to 100? No, Knas comes in and says nothing. Same idea, that's what? That Knas says, when I find more than a quarter sa'ah of impurity mixed in, what does the Knas approach say? Go in there, remove all of the impurity, and ultimately Reuven is obligated to make me whole. To which the Gemara says, Hasam vada ikarama. Here's the difference. In the case of the money yahrzheit, I know that someone is definitely acting without good faith. Someone is lying. I will say that is for sure. Someone is lying. In the case of the produce, I will say it is possible that what? What is possible? It's possible that there is actually no deceitful behavior over here. It is possible that just more than a quarter of impurity got mixed in. Not that Reuven purposely mixed it in. Maybe Reuven is just a little bit sloppy on the threshing floor, whatever it might be. But it is possible that there wasn't deceitful behavior over here, and just lamaisa, again, some additional impurity got mixed in. Okay, Tashma. Let's go back there. Shtar sheish mo ribis konsin also. So many great cases here today. If you have a shtar that has ribis in it, so we'll say so again. Reuven lent Shimon money. He lent him $1,000, and the shtar says, and Shimon is going to pay Reuven back $1,100. Ribis. What's the halacha? Konsin also. In this case, we go ahead and we penalize the lender. Ve'ena go beloas hakaren beloas haribis Rabbi Meir. So Meir says we penalize the lender, and the lender can't collect principal or interest. Essentially, we render the document totally unusable. So what do you see from here? You see from here that where there's a knas, so where there's deceitful behavior, so knas sets in, and what does that do? That penalizes the person in everything, even in the heter part. So I would say, I understand you can't collect the ribis, the interest, but the principal, why can't they collect the principal? Which says once again, it's very different. He'll say, in the case of ribis, the deceit was present from the beginning. From the beginning, this was a ribis transaction. Once again, in the case of the impurities, maybe it is possible that there was a mistake that happened over here. It's possible that there was a mistake and it wasn't deceitful. So Rabbi say, so what comes out over here is as follows. So again, remember, so we're still stuck. It's one of these interesting ideas where the statement of Rav Huna is being uncontested in the Gemara. Right? Everyone is agreeing with Rav Huna that if you find more than a quarter sa'ah of impurity, you can go ahead and sift out the entire amount. The machlokes is, what is the logic? Is it a din? Or is it a knas? So the Gemara is trying to bring a whole bunch of cases to seem to support one approach or contradict another approach. That hasn't worked. So we're going to stop over here for today. Again, still leaving off the mitzvos. I just want to end off with, I think, a tremendous Musar Haskell. What is the tremendous Musar Haskell from this Gemara? I'll say tremendous Musar Haskell. That in life, you always have to accept some level of impurity in whatever it is that you're doing. So often, the reason why Yomim Noraim becomes a frustrating exercise for us, and there is, so many people suffer from acute Yomim Noraim anxiety. Instead of feeling this incredible wave of joy that I'm about to spend weeks with the Melech, weeks with the King. And yes, there is judgment, but always important to remember who I'm being judged by. I'm being judged by a Father who loves me, a Father who takes care of me, a Father who looks after me. There's often this feeling of incredible anxiety, and that anxiety stems from this erroneous mindset that the goal is to become perfect, right? That this goal is, I need to up my game. And what does it mean to up my game? I need to stop sinning. I need to do this. I need to do that. And we create these expectations of ourselves that are absolutely impossible to live up to, or at least impossible to sustain. Maybe you could get there for a little bit of time, but absolutely. So there's this anxiety because I know how this works. I promise I fail. I promise I fail. I promise I fail. I'm good, I'm bad, there's peaks, there's valleys, and there's this anxiety about not being able to measure up. And the Basra comes along the Ribbon Shalom and gives us a beautiful daf on Erev Shabbos of Slichus as we begin this season of Tshuva. And what does the Ribbon Shalom tell us? Just read the words. Hamocher peros lechavero hareze mekabel alav rovet tinofus l'sa'ah. The way life works is whether you're purchasing produce or building a life. Always accept some level of impurity. I am never going to be perfect. There are always going to be parts of me that are in a state of disrepair, and some of them that are even profoundly broken. And you know what? It's okay. It's okay. Because that's what we accept. That's what we accept in the marketplace. That's what we accept in the world of tshuva. That's what we accept. And if you enter into Yomim Noraim, accepting the fact, I'm going to try better. That's the goal. I'm going to do better. I'm going to be better. But there's always going to be some level of impurity in my life, in my persona. And just like when you purchase produce, the seller knows it, the purchaser knows it. When I come before HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Yomim Noraim, I know it, and the Ribono Shel Olam knows it. But here's the incredible part. Even when everyone knows that there's some level of impurity that's there, the transaction is ironclad. The transaction is 100% valid. You could do tshuva and still be imperfect. You could come home and still have impurities. You could create a beautiful relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even in the sea of things that are broken. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has already accepted that about us. If we just accept that about ourselves, there is no telling the Yomim Noraim we could have. I do say Shkayach and Good Shabbos.